The smell of diesel and wet rope still hung in the shed when Daniel wiped his hands on a salt-stiff rag and said, "The fleet goes to Tobías. The licensed boats, the dock, the permits, all of it. And for you, Inés, that old skiff sunk in the mudflat at low tide is enough." Nobody spoke at first. You could hear gulls outside, the clink of a loose shackle against a piling, the little drip of seawater from somebody's coat onto the floorboards. Tobías lowered his eyes, but not from shame. More from that quiet satisfaction people get when life hands them what they already believed was theirs. Inés just stood there with her fingers curled around the back of a chair, feeling splinters press into her palm. Daniel cleared his throat and made it worse. "A man can keep a fleet moving," he said. "A woman needs something simpler. You'll make your own way." Inés looked at him then, really looked. At the beard gone white with salt, at the face the harbor trusted, at the father who had watched her bait hooks, scrub decks, patch torn gloves, and carry fish boxes heavier than her own body when she was barely grown. And still, when the time came, he saw her as less. She did not cry there. She did not beg. That was not in her. She walked out past the sheds, past the cold smell of kelp and iron, until the flats opened before her. And there it was, the boat he had left her. Half buried in black silt, one side tilted, one plank split open like an old scar. If this opening pulls you in, like the story, and stay with me, because Inés had not yet touched the hull. She stood there a long moment, with the wind pushing at her coat and the smell of salt mud rising around her. And what hurt her most was not the boat itself. It was that her father had looked at all her years of work and still seen something small. Inés had been useful on the water since she was a child. She knew how to shake sand from the nets before daylight, how to gut fish without wasting meat, how to stack crates so they would not slide when the deck pitched. At home, she had learned the other half of that life too, the part men often talked over. She had scrubbed scales from the sink, mended sleeves stiff with brine, boiled coffee before dawn, and stood at the stove with steam on her face while her father and brother came in smelling of tide and engine smoke. Tobías grew up there too, of course. But even as a boy, he carried himself like the harbor already owed him something. If there was a line to coil, Inés did it. If there was bait to salt, she did that too. Tobías liked the leaving and returning, the look of work more than the work itself. Daniel saw the son he wanted to trust, and somehow missed the daughter already proving herself with her hands. That was why she did not walk away from the skiff. She stepped closer, boots sinking into the cold edge of the mudflat at low tide, and crouched by the cracked side. Her fingers traced the grain of the soaked wood. Then she heard a voice behind her say, "If you're thinking of saving that one, you'll need more than stubbornness." Inés turned and saw Owen Mercer standing a few steps back, his rubber boots silvered with mud, his old ferry coat buttoned wrong against the wind. Everybody along the shore knew him. He had spent half his life carrying people across narrow water in weather that made younger men stay home. She straightened slowly. "I'm not asking anyone to save it." Owen gave the skiff a long look, then nodded once. "Good." Because saving a boat and saving your pride are not the same job. He came closer, pressed his thumb into a dark seam, tapped the side with his knuckles, listened to the dull sound, then scraped at the split plank with the tip of a pocket knife. "She's taken water for a long time," he said, "but the bones aren't gone yet." Those words settled somewhere deep in her chest. The tide was already thinking about turning, and the mud made a sucking sound around their boots. Owen pointed to the stern, half buried in silt. "If you mean to haul her out, you'll need rollers, a winch, and more patience than anger. Anger burns hot and quits early." Inés looked back toward the sheds where her brother now stood inside everything that used to belong to all of them. She could almost hear the men talking around him, already calling him boss. Then she looked down at the boat again, at the soaked planks, the weed caught around the keel, the work no one wanted. "Tell me what to do," she said. Owen did not smile. He only said, "Be here before first light and bring chains." By first light the next morning, the flats were silver with frost, and Inés was there with borrowed chains over her shoulder and a hand winch dragging against her leg. Her breath came out white. The mud was hard at the top and soft beneath, the kind that grabbed your boots as if it wanted company. Owen had already set down rough planks and old rollers. He did not waste words. He showed her where to fasten the chain low, where the hole could still bear strain, where not to pull unless she wanted the whole side to tear open. Then he stepped back and let her work. It was ugly work. Cold iron burned her palms. The winch groaned. The skiff shifted an inch, then none at all. Inés leaned her weight into it again, shoulders shaking, jaw tight, the smell of brine and old rot thick in the air. Mud slurped at the keel each time it moved. Owen said only what mattered. Again. Then, "Not there." Then, after a long silence, "Now." When the boat finally lurched free of the deepest suck, Inés almost fell backward. She laughed once, short, surprised, more from exhaustion than joy. Up by the sheds, two men stopped to watch. One of them called out that she was spending good strength on firewood. Owen ignored him. Inés did too, but she heard it. They got the boat onto firmer ground by noon. The tide was returning, gray and cold, licking over the place where it had been trapped. Owen crouched beside the hull, ran his hand along the broken seam, and said, "You've pulled it clear. Now comes the harder part. I need to show you what's rotten, and what only looks rotten." From that day on, the boat stopped being an insult and became work. Owen brought a short-handled hammer, a pry bar worn smooth with age, and a bucket that smelled of tar and old salt. Inés brought what she could afford: sandpaper, nails counted twice before buying, and bread wrapped in cloth for the middle of the day. They worked beside the shed with the wind pushing through every crack in the boards. He taught her to listen to wood before cutting it, to press a blade into a seam and tell the difference between damp timber and dead timber. "Don't tear out more than you must," he said. "A boat remembers the hands that rush it." So she learned slowly. She pried away split planks, scraped out blackened caulking, and swept curls of shavings from the floor until her wrists ached. At night, she took small jobs to pay for more material, cleaning scales from tables, mending torn oilskins, sorting shellfish baskets for a man at the quay. Her fingers stayed sore. Her clothes smelled of brine, pine dust, and lamp smoke. And every evening, when she passed her father's dock, she could hear Tobías talking big about engines, crews, and next season's profits, as if the tide itself had chosen him. Inés said nothing. Then, one cold afternoon, Owen ran his palm along the side she had repaired and gave the faintest nod. "That," he said, "is the start of a recaulked wooden hull." She looked at the skiff, really looked at it, and for the first time wondered whether she had been wrong about one thing. Maybe it was never meant to chase fish at all. That thought stayed with Inés all through the next week. While she planed edges smooth and pressed fresh caulking into the seams, Owen kept talking in that plain way of his, never lecturing, just setting down truth like a tool on a bench. He told her some boats were built for open water and heavy nets. Others were made for shallows, for channels that emptied down to ribbed sand, for work close to the ground where the tide pulled back and showed its secrets. "Your father gave you a boat with a shallow belly," he said. "He just didn't know what he was giving." Inés stopped with the mallet in her hand. Outside, she could hear Tobías laughing on the dock, boasting to two deckhands about catches he had not made yet. Inside the shed, all she could smell was pine shavings, tar, and cold salt. She looked at the skiff again, not as a failed fishing boat, but as something meant to cross thin water. That was when she began asking questions. At the quay, while delivering baskets and wiping down a shell table for extra cash, she listened more than she spoke. An older woman mentioned a stretch of tideland nobody wanted because bigger boats could not get near it. A man unloading shell bags grumbled about permits and seed. Another spoke of oysters as if they were slow money, but steady money if a person had patience and a back strong enough to bend. If you're listening from somewhere near the sea, or even far from it, tell me in the comments where you are. Stories like this travel farther than boats do. That evening, Inés spread a tide chart on Owen's workbench, tapped one narrow inlet with her finger, and asked him, "If I stop chasing fish, could this boat carry something better?" Owen did not answer her right away. He unfolded the tide chart, laid two thick fingers on the narrow inlet she had chosen, and studied it as if it were a face he almost remembered. Then he said, "If the water runs clean there, and if the bottom is right, yes. Oysters don't need a loud man shouting over an engine. They need steady hands and somebody willing to return every low tide." That night, Inés hardly slept. She kept seeing the place in her mind, the thin creek mouth, the flats shining under retreating water, the skiff gliding where deeper boats would stick fast. By morning, she had made up her mind. She took what little money she had saved from winter jobs, wrapped it in paper, and went to ask about leasing that stretch of tideland. The office was small, smelling of damp coats and old forms. The woman behind the desk looked over the application, then over her glasses. "It's not easy ground," she said. "That's why it's still available." Inés almost smiled. Easy ground had never been offered to her anyway. The fee left her with almost nothing. After that came the next cost: seed, gear, mesh bags, stakes, rope. Owen helped her list what mattered first and what could wait. On the way back, she passed her father's dock. Tobías was there in clean boots, talking about repainting one of the larger boats, promising men he would grow the business fast. He looked like someone already spending tomorrow. Before sunset, Inés stood beside her skiff, ran her hand over the side she had repaired, and whispered, "All right, now we work for ourselves." The only trouble was, she still had no idea where to find her first oyster spat on the racks. She found it through the same kind of quiet paying attention that had carried her this far. At the quay, Inés kept taking the small jobs nobody bragged about. She rinsed shell grit from plastic crates, tied broken cords back onto mesh bags, and wiped down the scales after the buyers had gone. One damp afternoon, while the air smelled of seaweed and cold metal, she heard two growers arguing over a missed pickup. One of them had more seed than rack space. The other had lost ground in a silt shift and could not take his share. Inés said nothing at first, then asked one careful question. By dusk, she was standing beside stacked bags no bigger than feed sacks, each one full of tiny shells clinging together in clusters. The grower eyed her patched sleeves and asked if she even had water to put them on. She told him she had leased ground and a boat that could reach it. He named a price that made her stomach drop. She counted out what she had, held back just enough for rope and fuel, and took only part of the lot. That was how it began, not with abundance, but with just enough. Owen helped her load the skiff the next morning. The wood creaked, but held. Frost still silvered the grass above shore, and the channel was thin as poured lead. He showed her how to set the first stakes, how to space the bags, how to think ahead to current and silt. By noon, there it was, her first stretch of oyster spat on the racks, laid out over the flats like a promise too fragile to speak aloud. Then the wind shifted hard from offshore, and Owen looked up at the sky with a face she had not seen before. She saw it too, a second later. The light had gone flat, and the water in the channel lost that easy shine it had in the morning. Even the gulls had pulled inland. "Leave the last row," Owen said. "Now." They worked fast after that. Inés dragged the empty bags into the skiff, hands numb from wet rope, boots slipping in the slick sand. The new stake stood out on the flats in thin, stubborn lines, with her first seed tied where the tide would soon cover it. It did not look like much to anyone passing by. To her, it looked like every coin she had left in the world. By the time they pushed off, the wind was already hitting in sharp bursts. The boat rode low but true. She felt each slap of water against the side she had repaired with her own hands. Owen kept his eyes ahead. "Don't fight the chop," he said. "Let her work." Inés held the tiller and listened. That was the strange thing. Even in rough water, the skiff seemed to know its own balance better than she did. The blow came through the night. She lay awake, hearing it in the roof and gutters, hearing loose things knock and scrape outside, imagining mesh bags torn loose and scattered, stakes wrenched sideways, months of hope washed into dark water before they had even begun. At dawn, she was already pulling on damp clothes when someone pounded once on the doorframe. It was Owen. His beard was wet with mist, and he did not bother with greeting. "The tide's out," he said. "If you want to know what the storm left you, come now." She went with him without even stopping for coffee. The morning air bit at her throat. Frost cracked under her boots near the shore grass, and the channel had that hard gray look water gets after a bad night. Inés pushed the skiff off with hands that still felt half asleep, then rowed in short, quick pulls while Owen watched the flats ahead. The first sight of the lease hit her like a fist. One line of stakes was leaning wrong. Two mesh bags had torn loose and washed several yards off. A corner of the ground had taken on fresh silt, smooth and pale, where her boot prints had been the day before. For a moment, she just stood there in the cold, hearing nothing but wind in her hood and the click of shells shifting in the surviving bags. All that work, all that money, and the sea had brushed past it in one dark night as if it meant nothing. Owen did not comfort her with easy words. He bent, picked up one of the loosened ties, and said, "Good, now you know where it fails." That brought her back. They spent the whole tide resetting what they could, driving deeper braces, moving one row to firmer ground, tying with heavier line. Mud sucked at their knees. Salt stung the skin around Inés's cracked fingernails. By noon, she was shaking from cold and effort, but the layout stood straighter than before. On the way in, they passed Daniel's dock. One of Tobías's better boats was rubbing badly against a piling, paint scarred fresh along the side. Two deckhands were arguing on shore, and Tobías was nowhere in sight. Owen glanced once, then back at her skiff. "Some people lose things in storms," he said quietly. "Others lose them in sunshine." And that same afternoon, a man from the harbor stopped Inés beside the landing and asked if she expected to have any harvest worth tasting before long. That question stayed with her for weeks. Inés did not answer the harbor buyer with pride she had not earned yet. She only said, "If the water stays clean and the shells set well, I'll let you know." After that, her days settled into the kind of labor that does not look dramatic from shore. Every low tide, she took the skiff out, checked the ties, lifted the mesh, rinsed grit, turned the bag so the shells would grow evenly, and watched for the small changes that mattered. Her sleeves stayed wet to the elbow. Her back ached by noon. Still, when she split one sample shell against the gunnel and saw healthy growth inside, something quiet and bright moved through her. The first trial batch was small, but it was good. She carried it herself to the key market in a plain cooler with shaved ice and a folded cloth over the top. The buyer from before opened one, tipped it to the light, then another. He did not say much, which made Inés more nervous than if he had complained. Then he nodded once and named a price fair enough to make her grip the cooler handle tighter. It was the first money the skiff had ever brought her. That same afternoon, walking back past Daniel's dock, she saw what the harbor had already begun whispering. One berth sat empty where a licensed boat should have been. Another vessel leaned poorly on its lines, green growth thick around the waterline. Tobías stood arguing with a man in a clean coat, voice sharp, hands restless, while two crewmen watched from a distance and did not come closer. If you've ever seen someone waste what another person would have treasured, you know that look. When Tobías turned and noticed Inés watching, he stopped speaking mid-sentence and started walking toward her. He slowed when he reached her, as if he had come over ready for one kind of conversation and then lost his nerve halfway through. Up close, Tobías looked different, just worn around the edges in a way Inés had never seen on him before. His collar was open, his jaw rough with stubble, and there was a sharp smell of coffee gone cold on his coat. He glanced at the cooler in her hand, then toward the little skiff tied at the landing. "So," he said, trying for lightness and missing it, "I hear you've got buyers now." Inés did not offer him the easy road. "A few." He nodded, eyes moving away from hers. For a moment, all they could hear was halyards tapping against masts and water slapping under the dock. Then he asked if she had any cash to lend. Just enough to smooth over a payment, cover a gap, keep things moving until the next sale. He said it fast, like a man talking ahead of his own shame. Inés looked past him to the dock he had inherited whole. One license gone, one boat sitting too low. Men no longer gathering around him the way they had in those first weeks. The truth was plain, even if he did not say it. "No," she answered. "Not hard, not soft either, just clear." Tobías laughed once through his nose, but there was no humor in it. You always did know how to make a person feel small. She almost answered that he should know what that felt like. Almost. Instead, she shifted the cooler in her hand and said nothing. Then, before he turned away, he looked at her boat one more time and asked a stranger question than the first. "Do you need help on the tide tomorrow?" Inés did not answer him on the dock. She let the question hang there between them, with gulls crying overhead and the smell of low water coming up through the pilings. Tobías shifted his weight, waiting for a quick yes or a clean no, the way life had always answered him before. But this was not one of those times. "If you come," she said at last, "you come to work, not to advise, not to borrow. Work." He gave one short nod. "What time?" "Before dawn." The next morning he was there, in old boots that had seen better years and gloves too thin for the cold. Owen said nothing when he saw him. He only handed Tobías a coil of line and pointed toward the skiff. The tide had pulled back far enough to show long black ribs of weed and sand. The air stung the inside of the nose. Inés stepped aboard first, and her brother followed without argument. That first tide told the truth. He slipped once in the mud and caught himself with both hands. He lifted bags badly, too much with his back, not enough with his legs. He asked two foolish questions, and then, to his credit, stopped pretending he knew more than he did. Inés corrected him sharply once, quietly the next time. Owen showed him how to brace a stake, how to rinse shell without wasting motion. By the end of the morning, Tobías was soaked to the knees, breathing hard, and finally silent. If you've ever had to start over under someone else's rules, you know how long one morning can feel. When they pulled back in, Owen glanced over the lease, then at the rows beyond it, and said there was one thing left to decide before the next spring tide: whether they were ready to expand. By the next spring tides, the answer had already been given by the water. The rows had multiplied. What began as a few careful bags had become a working stretch of ground that filled the channel with purpose each low tide. Inés stood in the skiff, with a harvest knife at her belt and a pencil behind one ear, calling out weights, checking shell, watching the light move over the flats. Tobías came each morning before dawn without being chased out of bed, and he worked the way men do when excuses have finally worn thin. He rinsed, lifted, tied, carried. No speeches, just labor. Behind them, other small boats waited their turn to load. Meanwhile, Daniel's grand inheritance had gone the way neglected things go. Another license had been sold. Two of the better boats never returned to honest use. One settled crooked at its mooring and stayed there, gulls on the rail, green water lapping at a hull nobody had cared for in time. People at the harbor stopped asking what happened. They could see it. And then came the morning the buyer sent for a full harvest run. The tide was barely turning when the little boat moved first, its bow cutting the pale water ahead of the others, the one that knew where the channel was. Inés held the tiller. Tobías worked the stern line. Behind them, the loaded boats followed out in a slow gray file toward open water and the waiting trade. Some timber sinks where it is left. Some, hauled clear and mended in the cold, learns the shape of its true work. By the time the sun cleared the marsh grass, the wake behind that old skiff shone like hammered silver. If this story stayed with you, leave your town or country in the comments, and pass it on to someone who needs to remember that being overlooked is not the end of the story.